No one noticed the moment he decided to leave because power, for the first time in years, had quietly failed him. The restaurant glowed in soft amber light, the kind that made crystal glasses shimmer and expensive suits look even sharper. But at table 14, the air felt different, colder somehow, like something invisible had gone wrong. Kenji Takahashi sat perfectly still, his posture straight, his charcoal suit tailored to precision, his presence unmistakably powerful even in silence. Yet no one approached him anymore. The first server had tried, offering a rehearsed smile and a menu he couldn't read, her voice too fast, her patience too thin. The second had lasted less than a minute before excusing himself with a tight nod. By the third attempt, the staff had already begun to avoid eye contact entirely, drifting around his table as if it didn't exist. To them, he was not a man of global influence, not the architect of a billion-dollar empire, but a complication, a disruption in the smooth choreography of service. Around him, the restaurant continued its quiet performance, forks clinking softly against porcelain, low laughter rising from nearby tables, deals being made in confident English he understood but refused to answer in. Not tonight. Kenji's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the menu, unmoving, his eyes scanning lines he did not need to read. Not really, because this was never about the food. Somewhere across the city, a meeting waited for him, a negotiation worth more than most people in the room would earn a lifetime. And yet here he was stalled by something as simple as a language no one cared enough to bridge. A faint exhale escaped him, barely visible, but heavy with something deeper than frustration. It was disappointment. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and familiar, like a memory he had learned to carry without showing. At the service station, a manager leaned in close to whisper something sharp, his eyes flicking briefly toward table 14 before turning away again, dismissing the problem rather than solving it. The staff followed his lead. It was easier that way. Easier to pretend the man in the corner did not matter. And for a moment, it almost worked. Kenji reached for the water glass, paused, then set it back down untouched. His gaze shifted toward the exit, calculating, weighing time, dignity, and the cost of staying in a place that could not see him. The decision formed slowly, not out of anger, but clarity. He would leave, not because he had to, but because nothing here was worth the effort of being misunderstood. Across the room, unnoticed by everyone except the quiet rhythm of her own breath, Emily Carter stood with a tray balanced lightly in one hand, her movements precise, her presence nearly invisible. Just another waitress in a black uniform moving between tables that demanded more than they deserved. But her eyes were not on her section. They were on him. She had been watching long enough to notice what others missed, the way his shoulders never slumped, the way his gaze never wandered, the way his silence carried weight instead of confusion. And then, almost imperceptibly, she heard it. A single word, barely spoken, slipping past his lips like a habit he hadn't realized he still had. Japanese. Not loud. Not directed at anyone, just there. And in that quiet second, something shifted. Not in the room. Not yet. But inside her. The word lingered in the air, soft and almost weightless. But to Emily it carried a precision she had not heard in years. The cadence exact, the tone restrained, the kind of Japanese that was not learned from textbooks, but lived through silence and discipline. She did not move right away. Instead, she watched him the way he had been watching the room, not for what was obvious, but for what was missing. No impatience in his posture, no restless tapping, no demand for attention. Just stillness. A kind of stillness that did not belong in a place built on noise and service. Around her, the rhythm of the restaurant continued uninterrupted. A server laughed too loudly near the bar. A couple debated wine choices in hushed excitement. And somewhere behind her, a manager reminded staff to keep things moving, to keep the tables turning, to keep the illusion intact. But at table 14, time had already slowed. Emily adjusted the tray in her hand, the weight familiar, grounding. For a brief second, she considered walking past him like everyone else had. It would have been easy. It would have been safe. It was not her table. Not her responsibility. Just another guest who did not fit neatly into the system. But something about the way he had said. That single word stayed with her, not as a sound, but as a memory. A train platform, early morning light, her father's voice, calm and measured, correcting her pronunciation without ever raising his tone. She had been 12, standing too stiff, trying too hard, repeating phrases until they felt natural. Language, he used to say, is not about speaking. It is about respect. Emily exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and set the tray down on the service station with a soft, controlled motion. No one noticed. No one was supposed to. She smoothed the front of her apron, a habit more than a necessity, then stepped away from the station and into the flow of the room. Each step was measured, unhurried, blending into the movement of other servers passing by, her presence folding into the background the way it always had. But her direction was different. She was not circling tables or checking on orders. She was walking toward him. Kenji did not look up as she approached. His gaze remained on the table, distant but focused, as if he had already removed himself from the space without physically leaving. Up close, the details were sharper, the faint crease at the edge of his sleeve, the precise alignment of his glass, the quiet discipline in every small choice he made without thinking. Emily stopped just short of the table, close enough to be heard, far enough to remain respectful. For a fraction of a second, she said nothing. The silence stretched, not awkward but deliberate. Then, with a small, controlled breath, she inclined her head just slightly, not exaggerated, not performative, but exact. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, and unmistakably fluent. The words were simple, but the tone carried everything that mattered. It was not just language. It was understanding. Kenji's hand, which had been resting near the edge of the table, stilled completely. The shift was immediate, but quiet, like something internal had been interrupted mid-thought. Slowly, he lifted his gaze. Not sharply, not surprised in the way most people would expect. Just precise. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since he had entered the restaurant, there was recognition in them, not of who she was, but of what she had just done. The room around them did not change. The conversations continued. The glasses still clinked. But at table 14, the balance had already begun to shift. For a moment, neither of them spoke again, and yet the silence no longer felt empty. It had weight now, intention, something shaped by recognition rather than absence. Kenji studied her carefully, not in suspicion, but in precision, the way a man does when he has spent a lifetime reading details others overlook. Her posture was correct, but not rigid. Her gaze steady, but not challenging. Her tone respectful without slipping into performance. It was exact, not memorized, not rehearsed for show. Exact. His eyes shifted slightly, just enough to confirm what he already understood. She was not guessing. She knew. When he finally responded, his voice was low, controlled, the same language returning to him as naturally as breath. But this time there was a subtle difference in the rhythm, a fraction softer, as if the presence of someone who understood had removed the need for restraint. Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her attention absolute. Each word he spoke carried layers beneath it, not just meaning but context, tone, expectation. She did not rush to answer. She allowed the space to exist, just long enough to show that she was not translating, she was understanding. When she replied, her words were measured, precise, matching his level of formality without exaggeration, her pronunciation clean, her cadence steady. The exchange was simple on the surface, a greeting, a question about his evening, an offer to assist, but beneath it, something far more significant had already taken place. Around them, the restaurant began to notice. Not the language itself, most could not recognize it, but the shift. The manager at the service station paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched the interaction from a distance. One of the servers slowed as she passed, glancing toward table 14 with quiet confusion. Just minutes ago, that table had been avoided. Now, it held stillness of a different kind. Not tension, control. Kenji leaned back slightly in his chair, not as a display of comfort, but as a recalibration, his shoulders easing by a degree so small most would miss it. He asked a question, something brief, and Emily answered without hesitation, her tone unchanged, her delivery consistent, as if this conversation had been waiting to happen all along. A faint sound reached the table, the soft ticking of a watch as his wrist shifted. Against the linen, a detail as precise as everything else about him. Time was moving again. Emily reached for the menu, not abruptly, not slowly, but with quiet intention, adjusting it slightly so it faced him at the correct angle, a gesture so small it bordered on invisible, yet entirely deliberate. She spoke again, this time guiding the conversation forward, not leading, not directing, but aligning, offering options in a way that respected both his time and his expectations. Kenji listened, and for the first time since he had entered the restaurant, he gave a small nod, not to the menu, not to the service, but to her. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried more weight than anything that had happened before. Across the room, the manager straightened, his earlier dismissal fading into something closer to concern, as if he had just realized that something valuable had nearly been lost. But at table 14, that moment had already passed. The balance had shifted, not through force, not through demand, but through something far quieter. Understanding. And once it was there, it could not be ignored. The change did not need to be announced. It revealed itself in the smallest adjustments. In a way, Emily's movements became more deliberate around that single table. In a way, Kenji no longer looked toward the exit, but instead remained still, present, engaged in a space he had nearly abandoned. She stepped back just enough to give him room, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture composed, waiting not for instruction, but for the natural continuation of the exchange. Kenji glanced briefly at the menu again, but this time it was different, not as a barrier, but as a formality, something secondary now that the real obstacle had been removed. He spoke again, his tone quieter, more conversational, the structure of his sentences loosening slightly, as if the need to remain guarded had faded by a degree. Emily listened carefully, her focus unwavering, and when she responded, she did not rush. Each word was placed with intention, matching his pace, his tone, his level of detail, offering recommendations not as a script, but as a conversation shaped around him. She described the dishes with clarity, adjusting her language subtly to reflect not just the menu, but his preferences, his cultural expectations, the balance of flavors that would matter to someone who. Notice details most people ignored. He watched her as she spoke, not interrupting, not correcting, simply observing, and for a moment, something almost unnoticeable crossed his expression. Not a smile, not approval in the usual sense, but a quiet acknowledgement that what he was experiencing was rare. Around them, the shift continued to ripple outward. A server at a nearby table hesitated before approaching her own guests. Distracted by the interaction she did not fully understand. The manager took a step closer, pretending to adjust the setting on the service station. But his attention was fixed entirely on table 14 now, his earlier indifference replaced with a careful, almost cautious awareness. He could not hear the words, but he could see the result. The table that had been avoided was now the calmest point in the room. Emily finished her explanation and allowed a brief pause, giving Kenji the space to decide without pressure. He nodded once, a precise movement, and spoke again, placing his order clearly, without hesitation. She repeated it back to him in Japanese, her tone steady, confirming each detail with accuracy before inclining her head slightly in acknowledgement. It was not exaggerated. It was not performative. It was correct. As she turned to leave, Kenji spoke once more, a short sentence, almost an afterthought, but one that carried weight. Emily paused just slightly, turning back to face him, her expression unchanged, her attention immediate. He asked her something not about the menu, not about the service, but about her. The question was simple, but it shifted the dynamic again, moving the conversation beyond necessity into something more personal, more intentional. For the first time, Emily allowed the smallest hint of warmth to touch her voice as she answered, still composed, still precise, but no longer entirely distant. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. Enough for Kenji to understand that she was not simply repeating knowledge, she had lived it. Enough for the room, even without understanding a single word, to feel that something important had just taken place. Emily turned and walked back toward the service station, her pace unchanged, her posture steady, but the atmosphere behind her had already transformed. At table 14, the silence was no longer an absence. It was control. The distance between the service station and table 14 had not changed, but when Emily returned, it felt different, as if the space itself had become more intentional, more aware of her presence than before. She carried the tray with quiet precision, each movement controlled, the polished glassware catching the warm light as she approached. But this time, no one mistook her for invisible. Kenji looked up before she reached the table, not abruptly, not expectant, but aware, as if he had already anticipated her return. That small shift alone altered everything. Emily placed the glass gently in front of him, aligning it with the exact edge of the setting, not a fraction off, her attention to detail matching his without needing to be told. She spoke softly, confirming the next course, her tone consistent, her words measured, but beneath it, there was something else now, a subtle confidence that had not been there when she first approached. Kenji responded, his voice steady, but no longer distant, the cadence of his speech easing into something closer to conversation than formality. He asked another question, this time more direct, not about the meal, not about the restaurant, but about how she had learned. Emily paused for the briefest second, not out of hesitation, but consideration, choosing her answer carefully. When she spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet depth behind it, a history she did not fully explain, only enough to be understood. She mentioned time spent abroad, a childhood shaped by movement, by listening more than speaking, by learning that language was not about words but about presence. Kenji listened without interruption, his gaze steady, absorbing not just the information, but the way she delivered it. There was no need to impress him. That was what made it different. Around them, the restaurant had begun to recalibrate. The manager now stood closer than before, no longer pretending not to notice, his posture slightly straighter, his expression more attentive, as if he were trying to understand what had shifted without fully grasping it. A server approached the station beside Emily, whispering something under her breath, a question wrapped in confusion, but Emily did not turn. Her focus remained where it belonged. Kenji leaned back slightly, his fingers resting near the base of the glass. And for the first time, there was a faint softness in his expression, not visible to most, but present enough to change the atmosphere around him. He spoke again, a short sentence, but this time there was a trace of something almost reflective, as if he were thinking aloud rather than issuing a statement. Emily understood immediately, her response coming with the same quiet precision. But this time, she allowed a subtle warmth to remain in her tone, not overstepping, not altering the balance, just enough to acknowledge the shift that had already taken place. The conversation, though still measured, had moved beyond necessity. It had become human. A moment passed where neither spoke, but the silence held something different now. Not tension, not distance, but mutual recognition. Emily stepped back slightly, giving space again, her role returning to its place, but the connection did not fade with it. Kenji nodded once more, slower this time, more deliberate, and as she turned to continue her work, his gaze followed her for just a second longer than before. Not because she had drawn attention, but because she had earned it. And in a room built on wealth, status, and noise, that quiet shift carried more power than anything else around it. By the time the first course arrived, the rhythm at table 14 had become something entirely its own, separate from the rest of the restaurant, as if an invisible boundary had formed around it, quiet but undeniable. Emily approached with the same measured pace, the plate balanced steadily in her hand, the aroma subtle but precise, the presentation exact down to the smallest detail. And when she placed it in front of Kenji, she did not announce it with unnecessary words. She simply aligned it, adjusted the angles slightly, and stepped back half a pace, allowing him to take in the moment without interruption. Kenji looked down at the dish, not with casual interest, but with the same analytical attention he had given everything else, noting the composition, the balance, the restraint in its design. Then he glanced up at her, a fraction longer than before, as if confirming that the care placed into the plate matched the care in the interaction. He spoke again, his tone quieter now, more reflective, and Emily responded with equal calm, her voice steady, her presence consistent, never overstepping, never retreating. Around them, the shift had become impossible to ignore. The manager moved closer, no longer pretending to adjust details, his attention fixed, his expression caught somewhere between curiosity and concern. A nearby table had grown quieter, their conversation fading as they noticed the subtle difference in how service unfolded at that single point in the room. It was not faster. It was not louder. It was simply more precise. Kenji lifted his fork, paused briefly, then took the first bite. The motion was small, controlled, but his reaction was not in the food itself. It was in the timing. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, not as approval of the dish, but as acknowledgement of the experience as a whole. Emily observed without staring, her eyes catching only what was necessary. And when she spoke again, it was not to ask a routine question, but to offer something more thoughtful, a subtle adjustment, a suggestion that reflected not just the menu, but his preferences as she had already begun to understand them. Kenji listened, and this time, when he responded, there was a faint shift in his tone, a trace of something lighter, as if the weight he had carried into the room had lessened by a degree he had not expected. He asked another question, this time slower, more deliberate, and Emily answered with the same clarity, her words matching his pace, her understanding extending beyond language into intention. The conversation deepened, not in volume, not in complexity, but in presence. Each exchange built quietly on the last, forming something that did not belong to the restaurant, or the menu, or the transaction. It belonged only to that moment. The manager finally stepped forward, his hesitation gone, his posture more formal now, attempting to reinsert himself into the interaction he had nearly lost control of earlier. He addressed Kenji in careful, practiced English, his tone overly polite, his words measured but lacking the ease that had already been established. Kenji turned his gaze toward him briefly, listening, but his response was short, courteous, and distant, as if acknowledging the effort without inviting it further. Then, almost without thinking, his attention returned to Emily. The difference was immediate. The manager noticed it. The room felt it. Emily did not react outwardly. She did not change her expression or posture. She simply continued, her presence steady, her role unchanged, but the balance had already been decided. What had started as a problem at table 14 had become something else entirely. Not a disruption, not a difficulty, but a quiet standard the rest of the room could not quite reach. The room had not grown louder, but it had grown aware, the kind of awareness that does not announce itself, only shifts the way people move, the way they listen, the way they measure what they thought they understood. At table 14, Kenji no longer looked like a man waiting for something to go wrong. He looked like a man who had decided to stay. Emily noticed it in the smallest detail, the way his hand rested more naturally against the table, the way his shoulders no longer carried that faint, invisible tension, the way his gaze remained present instead of calculating an exit. She returned with the next course, her steps unchanged, her expression steady, but there was a quiet certainty in her timing now, a rhythm that had aligned itself with his without needing to be adjusted. She placed the plate before him with the same precision as before, her movements clean, deliberate, leaving no room for correction. Kenji glanced at the dish, then at her, and this time there was no distance in the look. It was direct, acknowledging. He spoke, not as a guest issuing a request, but as a man continuing a conversation that had already found its place. Emily answered without hesitation, her voice calm, her tone balanced, but now there was a subtle ease between them, something that no longer needed to be built, only maintained. Across the room, the manager had stopped pretending entirely. He stood just within reach of the interaction, not interrupting, but not stepping away either, as if proximity alone might allow him to understand what had already slipped beyond his control. Another staff member approached him quietly, whispering a question, but he barely responded, his attention fixed, his earlier authority replaced by something closer to observation. He was watching something he could not replicate. Kenji lifted his glass, took a measured sip, then set it down with care, the soft contact against the table barely audible, but deliberate. He asked another question, this time slower, more thoughtful, and Emily responded with the same level of attention, her words reflecting not only his language, but his perspective, his expectations, the subtle cultural weight behind what he was asking. The exchange no longer belonged to the structure of service. It had become something else entirely, something built on recognition rather than obligation. A couple seated nearby glanced over again, their conversation pausing, not because they understood the language, but because they felt the difference, the quiet gravity of what was happening just a few feet away. Emily adjusted a detail on the table, a minor correction to the placement of the utensils, her fingers steady, her movements nearly invisible, but Kenji noticed. He always noticed, and in that moment, he gave a small, almost imperceptible exhale, the kind that does not signal relief, but acceptance, as if something had settled in a place exactly where it belonged. He spoke again, but this time, his words carried a different weight, not a question, not a request, but a statement, something reflective, something that reached slightly beyond the surface of the moment. Emily listened, her posture unchanged, her attention complete, and when she responded, her voice carried that same quiet depth, not matching him, but meeting him. The balance held, not forced, not fragile, just steady. And in a room filled with people trying to be seen, the most powerful shift remained the one that required no attention at all. The conversation did not rise in volume, yet it deepened in presence, like a current beneath still water that only those within it could feel. By the time the final course was prepared, the rhythm at table 14 had settled into something complete, something that no longer needed adjustment. Emily approached once more, the plate balanced with the same quiet precision, the details exact, the timing aligned not to the kitchen, not to the pace of the room, but to him. Kenji was no longer observing the space around him. He was fully within it. When she placed the dish before him, he did not immediately look down. Instead, his gaze met hers first, steady, intentional, as if acknowledging that what had been built between them mattered more than what was placed on the table. Only then did he glance at the plate, taking in its composition, the restraint, the care. He spoke, not to ask, not to confirm, but to comment, his tone reflective, carrying a nuance that suggested something beyond the meal itself. Emily listened, her expression composed, and when she responded, her voice held the same quiet clarity, her words chosen not for display, but for accuracy, for respect. Around them, the restaurant had shifted fully into awareness. Conversations continued, but softer. Movements remained fluid, but more measured. The manager stood at a distance now, no longer attempting to insert himself, only observing with a careful stillness, as if understanding that anything added would only disrupt what had already reached its balance. A server passed nearby, slowing just enough to glance toward the table, then continuing on, her curiosity unanswered. Kenji lifted his fork again, but this time, the motion was unhurried, not because he needed time, but because he had it. He took a bite, paused, and then set the fork down gently, his attention returning not to the dish, but to Emily. He spoke again, and this time, there was a shift that could not be mistaken. His words carried a question, but not one of necessity. It was personal, deliberate. A question about why she had chosen to remain where she was, in a place that did not fully recognize what she was capable of. The room did not hear the language, but it felt the weight of the moment. Emily remained still, her posture unchanged, but inside that stillness, there was consideration. She did not answer immediately. She allowed the space to exist, not as hesitation, but as respect for the question itself. When she finally spoke, her voice remained steady, but there was a quiet truth within it, something simple, something grounded. She spoke of choosing to observe, of learning through silence, of understanding people not by what they say when they are heard, but by what they reveal when they believe no one is listening. Kenji listened without interruption, his gaze unwavering, absorbing not just her words, but the meaning beneath them. When she finished, there was no immediate response. Just a brief, controlled breath, and then a nod, slower than before, more deliberate. It was not approval. It was recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken. Emily stepped back slightly, returning to her role, but the space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt defined, clear. Kenji reached for the glass again, his movement steady, and as he set it down, his fingers lingered for a fraction longer than necessary, as if marking the moment without drawing attention to it. The restaurant continued around them, but at table 14, something had already concluded, not with an ending, but with a quiet certainty. What had begun as a failure had become something else entirely, something that did not need to be announced to be understood. The check arrived without ceremony, placed gently at the edge of the table, its leather cover smooth, understated, almost invisible against the linen, and for a moment, neither of them reached for it. The conversation had already moved beyond anything that could be measured in numbers, beyond service, beyond expectation. Kenji looked at it briefly, then back at Emily, his gaze steady, thoughtful, as if weighing something that had nothing to do with the bill itself. The restaurant had begun to settle into its later rhythm, the subtle shift that comes when the evening matures, voices lowering, movements slowing, the energy softening into something more reflective. But at table 14, the stillness remained intentional, defined, complete. Emily stood with the same composed posture, her hands relaxed, her attention present but not intrusive, waiting not for action, but for closure. Kenji opened the check, his movements precise, unhurried, his eyes scanning the total with the same calm focus he had applied to everything else. He reached into his jacket, retrieving a card without looking at it, placing it inside with a motion so controlled it felt almost ceremonial. But then he paused. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the folder, and instead of closing it, he looked up again. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet weight, not formal, not distant, but deliberate. He said something that did not belong to the transaction, something that reached beyond the moment, acknowledging not just what she had done, but how she had done it. Emily listened, her expression unchanged, but her attention deepened, absorbing the meaning without interrupting it. When she responded, her voice remained calm, her words simple, grounded, not diminishing his statement, but not elevating it either, meeting it with the same quiet balance that had defined every exchange between them. There was no need for more. Kenji closed the folder, sliding it gently toward the edge of the table, but his hand lingered there for a second longer than necessary, as if marking the end of something that had not been expected. Emily stepped forward, taking the check with the same measured precision, her fingers steady, her movements unchanged, but the space between them felt different now. Not because it had grown, but because it had been defined so clearly it no longer needed to be crossed. As she turned to process the payment, the manager finally moved, stepping closer with a careful urgency, his voice low as he asked if everything had been satisfactory, his tone now carrying a respect that had been absent before. Kenji glanced at him briefly, offering a short response in English, polite, controlled, but distant, the kind of answer that fulfills obligation without inviting conversation. The manager nodded quickly, stepping back, understanding without needing explanation. When Emily returned, the receipt in hand, she placed it before Kenji, aligned perfectly, a pen set beside it at the exact angle. He signed without hesitation, his signature sharp, efficient, then closed the folder once more. This time, there was no pause. He stood, adjusting his jacket with a smooth, practiced motion, his presence returning fully, but not in the same way it had been when he entered. It was quieter now, more grounded. He looked at Emily one last time, his gaze steady, and inclined his head slightly, a gesture so small most would miss it, but precise enough to carry meaning. She returned it with equal subtlety, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. No words followed. None were needed. Kenji turned and walked toward the exit, his steps measured, his path clear, and as the door opened and closed behind him, the room seemed to exhale, the invisible tension dissolving back into the ordinary rhythm of the evening. At table 14, the setting remained untouched for a moment longer, the glass still catching the light, the chair slightly angled, a quiet imprint of what had taken place. Emily cleared it with the same care she had shown from the beginning, resetting each detail to its original state, as if nothing had happened at all. But the difference lingered, not in the room, not in the service, but in the understanding that something powerful does not need to be loud to be seen. And sometimes, the clearest language is the one spoken without ever raising your voice.